do it. Yeah.
formalities?
Yeah, let me
No?
let me do a quick formality just to welcome everyone. These are our talks, AMAs, demos, and discussions just about sparking ideas, sharing your open source projects, finding collaborators, and just kind of getting to know one another in the community. So today we have Ty Dunn and techfren with us. If you do have a topic you're passionate about or a project you'd like to share, just let me know. Reach out to me and I'll get you started. techfren, thanks so much. I'll kick it off to you.
My pleasure, thank you. Yeah, I think this show is mostly about Ty and Ty's company Continue and their vision Amplified Dev. I think it'd be great if you could give us a little rundown for people that are unfamiliar or a refresher on maybe the vision of Amplified or Continue or whatever you think is most relevant. Take it away.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, happy to do that. And then also, like, if people have questions along the way, I think a lot of this we want to be a kind of a discussion or whatever, right? So feel free. I don't know if there's like a raise hand feature, put in the chat or whatever, or maybe we can invite people, but just maybe not in the beginning. But if as I'm talking, right, something kind of comes up, please let us know, like what you want to know, what you want me to talk more about. But with that said, let me get into it. Yeah. So Amplified Dev, maybe it actually makes sense to share my screen here real quick. Okay, I would need to open system settings, so I'm not going to do that. But it's super easy to find. You can just go to amplified.dev and putting it in the chat there. It's a website, and the basic premise is the thing that's at the top of it, right? That we believe in a future where developers are amplified, not automated. So if you look at a lot of kind of the marketing and the way folks are kind of talking about large language models, AI, it's often framed as, and how they're going to affect developers. It's often like framed as an AI assistant, right? That's going to take over your job, right? And I think what's happened as a result of that is a lot of like kind of, I mean, I'm talking to developers all day, every day, and I mean, if you're kind of more new to the field, often you can get scared by this, right? Because you haven't seen the hype waves, you don't realize this is another hype wave that happens in technology, right? And then you think, right, that your job's not going to be there in 3 years and you should kind of leave the field, right? And then on the other end, if you're more experienced and you've been through these kind of hype waves and you're more familiar with the technology or you've kind of dove into it, you realize like, yes, it's incredibly helpful. It's going to change how we build software, but it's not going to automate our jobs anytime soon. And unfortunately, a lot of the vendors in the space, I think, are framing it like it's going to and over-promising and under-delivering. And so kind of the impetus originally for Amplified Dev and the idea behind it was like, could we sketch an alternative future? And so we ended up working with about a dozen or so platform development teams at organizations. So these are the folks who are in charge of the developer tools, the infrastructure, the productivity of their teams, kind of basically their kind of users are the other developers in the org. And those folks are the ones that we teamed up with to help write this. And we were just trying to come up with, at the minimum, right, kind of an articulation of the problems we're seeing when you adopt a black box, right? That is many other coding copilot solutions, right? Agent copilot solutions, those kind of things for software development. And the issue is like you can't understand the system, and if you don't understand the system, you don't know how it works. Like when you get a bad or wrong suggestion, right? You don't know why. You have no ability to actually change and use it, right? You can't instrument the system to know like, okay, are developers actually using it, and are they being successful with it, right? There's no way for people, all the developers in the organization, to actually improve it. Like they take up your data, right? And then you don't actually have that data incredibly valuable data about how you build software that can be used to improve the models and the suggestions you get in the future. That's taken away from you. You don't have choice over what models you use, right? Like it's amazing, right? The number of folks I talk to who don't realize that like GPT-4 doesn't power all of like the tab autocomplete experience, right? That is generally a model that's between like 1 and 22 billion parameters, no matter which Copilot vendor you get from, right? And that's like a really clear example of like where we're not getting kind of the innovation. We're not seeing the outcomes that we want to see with this technology because it's being hidden behind black boxes. And so our thesis with Amplified Dev is that we can break those black boxes. We can empower people to create their own systems. That's the idea behind Continue, is you can create your own AI code assistant, whether you're an individual developer and you just want to plug in your OpenAI key and have something nice in VS Code or JetBrains, or if you're the largest organization on the planet and you have a team dedicated millions of dollars and you're kind of building it out for everyone in your org. Like we want to serve kind of that vision and head towards that vision. And so to kind of bring it all home, right, the idea is like if we're going to automate software development more and more, right, you should be able to understand that system. You should be able to monitor it. You should be able to manage it. You should be able to improve it. And in the long run, right, if lots of software development tasks do get automated, you start to work on the system that now does the coding tasks you used to do, right? So you move to working on the AI software development system, on the AI code assistant, right, that does the work that you used to do. But instead of, just automating your job away with a black box, right, you are now moving to a higher level of abstraction. So it's much more similar to when we went from assembly to higher level programming languages, right, that it's just a more powerful way to build. So with that, we'll end, because that was a long spiel.
No, yeah, that was good. I agree with you. It's just adding to the abstraction from, as you said before, we were coding in assembly, and now we're even more amplified and getting closer to natural language. Yeah, if anyone else has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand. We can bring people up on stage. I'll kick things off with a few questions of my own, and we'll get the ball rolling. So amplified, you're kind of bringing to light some misconceptions that people see when they see Devon and stuff. They think, oh, software engineers, they're going to be completely taken over by these AI software engineers, and they're getting scared for their jobs. So you're saying that now these tools are more of like a way for software engineers to be more empowered and amplified rather than replaced. Do you expect that to be this way for like the foreseeable future, or do you think eventually we will get eventually like fully replaced, or do you have a timeline kind of thing?
Yeah, it's a question, the $1 million question, maybe $1 billion, these days, $1 trillion question, right?
That's right.
Yeah, I don't know, right? I think anyone who tells you either way, right? I can tell you what I do know. I can tell you, right? I've been in this space and using large language models since GPT-2 came out in early 2019, right? So I've seen the tremendous progress that GPT-2 had to GPT-3 and GPT-3 to GPT-4, right? And it's absolutely amazing what these models are capable of, right? The kind of limitations of supervised machine learning, right? And what they were able to do. For things like classification, right? It's wild what you can do with like in-context learning from large language models, and they seem to get better and better, right? And there's tons of resources being poured in, right? Not from just venture capital and developer time, right? But also, right, the largest companies on the planet, the cloud providers, are also kind of really betting on this future, right? And so I think it's really hard to do timelines and do progress, right? But I think there's a lot of room for kind of improvement, right? For making things smaller, faster, more capable. But at the same time, right, we're now starting to hit the limitations, right? Of we're running into like the size of, like, to scale things up, how much energy we're going to need, how much compute we're going to need, how much data we're going to need, right? We're really starting to hit constraints there. So it's like, okay, unless there's architecture breakthroughs or really novel research approaches, which lots of money's being poured in, time's being poured in, so maybe that does happen, right? But I think at a minimum, it's going to be a general text manipulation tool, right? That's why I think it's going to change software development. It's just, I think at a minimum, it's going to, as we've already seen with autocomplete and kind of placing Stack Overflow Q&A experiences with LLMs, at a minimum, it's going to like really change, right? Kind of how we go about building software, right? And then depending on how fast the AI progress occurs, maybe it starts to automate more and more. But I'm a believer that, in the long run, at a minimum, humans should be involved in at least monitoring the system. So in the very long run, I imagine developers like sitting around the table, right, and talking to each other, how the system is running, how we might be able to improve the system, where to point the system next, right? But I kind of don't believe in a future where we're allowing machine decisions to be final, right? Is maybe the most apt way to put it. I think developers should be involved. Humans should be involved.
That makes sense. And I guess, sorry for kind of giving you that question. It is very difficult to predict that future for sure. But yeah, maybe a bit more of an easier question. I actually I'm getting some of these questions from my community on Discord. This one was from Toprak. They're curious about the models that we can use with Continue. Obviously, Continue enables us to use pretty much whatever model we want. I'm curious if you internally or people in your community have tried different models, and what the best kind of, I guess, as a trade-off between price and effectiveness. Obviously, GPT-4o and Claude Opus could be probably the most effective, but they also come with a hefty price tag. So I'm curious to know what findings and what models have worked well with Continue.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. I think it's a core thesis, right? Is that like you should use the right models for the job, right? Pull us back to amplified dev, right? I think that's point number 2, right? And so, in the case of continue, right, you can kind of choose the right model. And so the first thing to understand is actually 3 models kind of choices you need to make with continue. You need to pick a model for the chat kind of experience where it's more like highlight some code, ask a question, right? Highlight some code, ask for it to be refactored or translated into a different language. Then you have the autocomplete, which I think people are more familiar with, where you can hit tab on your computer and the ghost text is accepted and edited. And then the one that people are generally like the least familiar with is the embeddings model, right? So how do you actually index your code base so that it can be retrieved, or index your Jira tickets, your Confluence docs, right? And all 3 of those choices are probably the biggest factors on how well the system performs, what suggestions you get. And so exactly which ones to use really depend on like kind of the things you mentioned, but even more, right? The price, the performance, what programming language you're using, often where you work, right? If you're using it at work, right? Some people can only use open source models because like they're not able to let their intellectual property at their company kind of leave the walls, right? Some people are like, we're an AWS Bedrock shop, right? And we make those accessible, so you're limited to the models there. And so it's hard to give like a general answer, but I can tell you like if you don't have constraints, or kind of the 2 different constraints we mainly see. So if you're kind of like going down the open source route, the models that we kind of recommend there, that we've seen like most folks use, like looking at the data, talking to folks on the autocomplete side, CodeStroll, I guess it's technically not open source. It has like a non-commercial license, right? So maybe this actually falls into the cloud, right? For autocomplete, it's the first time one of the large research labs have dedicated to the fill in the middle task to autocomplete. And it's incredibly good at that. It's part of our free trial now. You can even use it for chat. It's super cool. It's a 22 billion parameter model that you can use for both autocomplete and chat, which is, I mean, as new Macs come out, as new Windows laptops with GPUs come out, that's super exciting because like if we can kind of continue to squeeze that number down, right, it's going to be awesome. Where you can have one model that can do chat and autocomplete locally, and then on the, like you mentioned, Claude 3 Opus and GPT-4o are definitely the best for chat. A lot of people use the Azure OpenAI service for that, just because like you get a lot of security and privacy and 0 data retention. Your data is not being trained. So highly recommend that route if you're kind of coding in an organization. And then on the chat side, if you need to use an open source model, what we see is people will deploy them with VLLM. And generally, the best choice there is Llama 3 70B. Or DeepSeek Coder 33 billion. We see people deploying that. And usually you deploy that chat model at like once, and all of your developers kind of use it with continue. And then on the autocomplete side, right, DeepSeek Coder 6.75 billion or Star Coder 2, 3 billion are generally what folks use. And those are actually small enough, depending on what your computer hardware is, that some people actually push that local, and they have a completely local tab autocomplete experience with an open source model. So kind of in summary, I was a little bit all over the place. Autocomplete, open source, Star Coder 2, DeepSeek Coder 6.75 billion, Llama 3, 8 billion if you can't go big and you want to do completely local. But if you can deploy with OLLAMA or VLLM and server remotely, then Llama 3, 70B at the moment. And then if you can kind of go the commercial route, then CodeStroll for autocomplete and GPT-4 O and or Turbo or GPT-4. All 3 of them are, I mean, depending on your use case and your desires, are all like better for different pieces, is what we found. And then or Claude 3 Opus.
Nice.
That's kind of my answer on the open source side versus the commercial offerings.
That's a great answer. And Mike also, like, as I was asking that question, pretty much asked this pretty much the same question, but also extended it to ask if we've noticed any difference in quality based on, I think, provider, OLLAMA versus LM Studio versus Jan. I personally have a little bit of experience on that. I have like a M1 Pro laptop and a 2080 Ti, so I'm able to run like around the 7B models, and LM Studio seems to work well once it's running, though I've had sometimes it's slow to run. I really like Llamaphile because it's quick to run and compact, but I think I still haven't figured out how to properly set up like the presets or the prompt, like special tokens and stuff like that. So it sometimes gets like weird repetitiveness or something wrong. I think user error. But yeah, Ty, do you have any experience using these kind of local inference server hosting softwares, and what your preference is?
Yeah. So I've used Olama, LM Studio, Jan, Local AI, Llama right? And like kind of similar to what you said, techfren, right? It really depends on kind of at the moment, like none of them are perfect, right? Like, I think it really depends on your operating. So like back in the day, right? Like last year, this time, or maybe 9 months ago, right? Back in the day, like Olama was only on Mac, and LM Studio is only on Windows. So my recommendation at the time, right, was Olama if you're kind of doing more Mac, LM Studio for Windows, right? And because both of those were like that's where they kind of I think first optimized and were first good experiences, and so that's where I would kind of go. And then Llama File came out, right? And there's ways in which it's super nice to just like quickly pull a file if it's or like for a model that you is already supported, and then you can just run it. Like there's nothing better than like doing / in the model name and it's just going, right? And so those are the three I generally play around with. I play around with just because I'm building this, like continue and supporting them. But if I need something quick and go to at the moment, because I have a Mac, I continue to use Olama at the moment. I think they're really focused on just making it really simple, and they're often like the fastest people to get the new model up. And so generally kind of go with Olama. In terms of quality differences, I think it's just a matter of like how much setup time you want to put in. I think really the quality comes from the model, and that these providers, right, make certain defaults easier to change and to optimize and understand. And so I think it's probably worth like picking one and investing with it. And if you understand it deeply, then it becomes easy to get it to work as good as any of the other ones.
Yeah, nice. We have a question from Nathaniel with a bit of pre-text. I'm not sure if you can read that. I think I didn't fully understand the context, but the question was, will continue switch to a roadmap instead of a timeline development? Oh, actually, he's asked to come on stage, so we can actually, hold on, let me try to bring him up. Oh, did you put your hand down, Nathaniel? I actually haven't brought someone on stage before, so I'll figure this out. Are you actually? I'm not even a moderator. I think you have to do it. Yeah, go ahead. He's up.
Okay, I have to do it. There we go. Hey, Nathaniel.
Hey there. Thanks for hearing out my question. I was looking at it as roadmaps occasionally, or almost always nowadays, have somewhat artificial dates attached to them, and we know at project development how that can work. But it seems like that there are milestones or check marks or check boxes to we want to see this is the next thing for development, and then. So is there a roadmap of when this technology happens, then we're aiming for this feature set, or when this technology happens? I don't really, you were talking about timelines earlier, and I agree that some of this stuff is accelerating, some of it's slowing down. We are hitting caps on energy. But I was just reading about a model that generates 11 tokens a second on a cell phone, and there's some really fascinating stuff going on with parallel or perpendicular orthogonal thinking of do we even really need LLMs to do full paragraph level generation or just single word to kick off an entire different model for generation?
Yeah. Kind of two, I don't know if this is quite answering your question, but like where my kind of brain goes, like I think once again, like timelines or roadmaps of any kind are difficult when a space is so new and so fluid and there's so many people working on it, right? And there's so much great research. And I mean, I didn't see the research you mentioned, but that sounds incredibly promising, right? But I think what we're seeing is kind of two things happen. Maybe I can share my mental model, right? Is like model capabilities are improving, whether that means and performance is improving, right? So the models are getting smaller, they're getting faster, they're becoming more performant. So a good example of this is Llama 3 8 billion is about as good as Llama 2 70 billion, and it's a 1 year time difference, right? So that's a good example of like same model architecture, same provider, right? Same model trainer, Meta in this case, right? With 1 year's time, able to basically almost by order of magnitude decrease, factor of 10 decrease, right? What the model is capable of. And so we'll see how long that trend goes for and what it does. And then also on the frontier models, right? Like they're much bigger, right? But even the introduction of GPT-4 Turbo and GPT-4o started to unlock things that weren't possible. So you have like one kind of stream of those things going, and like those as the models do today is play with it. That's what we do. We like encourage the folks in our community to like tell us what they've learned that they can use it for, and we use that to inform, right? Like, okay, like today we can do autocomplete, we can do kind of a command I, give it some instructions to change like a function or a class. There's kind of the chat experience that replaces a lot of Stack Overflow, Googling. Like those are the things that we're seeing people actually use. And given the current model capabilities and stuff like that, and as these new models come out, we're using that input that we get from our community to help prioritize how do we improve those experiences, how do we, eventually get to new things that we want to drive. And then the other high part of it is like, I think that like there's like a capabilities overhang in the sense that like I think these models are capable of much more than like a lot of developers realize, and that it really comes down to how much time, how much experience have you put into actually playing with these? Have you put into actually using them?
I fully agree.
Yeah, you like really learn to use them, and like you learn when to use them, not to use them. You learn like when is it faster to do it yourself versus rely on the model to do it. And so I think there's a lot of like room for also improving like how we use them and what kind of experiences we have based on just learning from how people are using them and what they're even capable for. And both are just kind of explorations at the moment. And so when we're kind of in this phase of the technology, when it's progressing so fast, I think roadmaps are really difficult. And then the other piece you kind of also were talking about is I do think that there's going to be many models, right, that are based on the use case kind of set up, right? So like tab autocomplete versus chat is a really good example today, right? Like you don't need or use GPT-4 for tab autocomplete, right? It's not fast enough. It's not trained for fill in the middle. It's way too expensive, right? For tab autocomplete, it doesn't give you the suggestion within 500 milliseconds. And so to use a much smaller model makes sense there. And I think there's many use cases, many tasks that will require and use different models than necessarily the largest and biggest ones because they have kind of other constraints that they're optimizing for besides like pure raw benchmark performance.
Yeah. Does that answer all your questions, Nathaniel, or you have anything else?
No, that definitely does answer the initial question. That's like awesome. And unfortunately, kind of what I'm running into is when you have 8 different development pipelines, they're not going to talk to each other very well. And that I'm excited to see what we can keep doing with this stuff. The only other question I have that kind of would spin off its own conversation is in terms of picking the correct, like big air quotes, correct generation for a tab complete. I like to think of nuanced solutions if I'm doing something for optimization, but I absolutely want to use predictable, readable code for humans if I'm doing something on a collaborative project. Is there any kind of tip or trick you have for helping with that? Simple example being embedded programming on something like an Arduino or Raspberry Pi Pico. You're going to want to use highly optimized code instead of importing every library ever known. So you might end up rewriting your own weird matrix function kind of stuff instead of just using a Stack Overflow inspired example.
Yeah. My initial reaction there is like, I think it's as of like this last week, we make it super easy with Continue that you can have different models, like tab autocomplete models for different use cases. So my thought there would be like, and it can be, I think it might be a keyboard shortcut. If it's not, it should be, right? Where you can actually like figure out, okay, what is the model, the embedded kind of optimized code approach versus the README, right? And it can be just a keyboard shortcut in VS Code or JetBrains with Continue, right? And you can switch to that. And then not only is it you can maybe switch different models, right? But you can give different system messages, right? Where you say, I want optimized code this, right? And where you can really direct it and kind of basically think about like what kind of different software development do you do? What kind of different properties do you want out of the model, the suggestions you're getting, and really optimize, like think, right? Like in your case, you've done a great job of having this mental model. If you really want 2 different tab autocomplete systems in the same way that you invest in an RC file, like a bash RC file on your computer and make it your own for like a certain kind of developer environment, right? I think you should do the same thing for your tab autocomplete models, right? Like with Continue, this is more than possible. It's easy to do. We want to make it easier, right? Where we're choosing the right model and the right configuration, right? Maybe it pulls in context or doesn't in a different way, right? For each of those different things, but spending a little bit of time investing and thinking about what are the ways in which, what kind of suggestions do you want to get, and then architecting and configuring your different models that you're going to use for those different situations appropriately. That's number one. And then number 2 is I think there's going to be limitations to that, right? Because it's like, oh, I need to like switch models and I don't want to have to wait 5 minutes or whatever it takes to unload a model and reload it in LM Studio or something like that, right? And so I think the other thing to think about is like with continue, like when you use continue, every time you hit accept or reject with with tab autocomplete, it's dropped into a JSON file locally on your computer by default, and you have a bunch of data, right, on like what are you rejecting, what are you accepting, and you can use that data to fine tune models, right, that give you suggestions that are more like you want, right. But that's also just great data to just go look at and explore and look at, okay, where is this actually helping me? Where's this? Where am I always rejecting, right? And then you can use that to figure out like a better configuration in the future, right? And maybe that's even a great way to figure out your different use cases by looking at your data, right? And that's kind of one of the Amplified Dev tenets, right? Is we want you to have access to your data because that's data about how you build software. Right? You use other vendors, they just vacuum that up and to improve their experiences, but they don't give it to you to be able to really understand and customize your experience.
Awesome. Got a question from Flashy here. I know it's another tricky one, predicting the future, but can we expect a future where developers would just write code directly in natural language instead of code?
I think we
Personally,
already are
so
doing that,
before the head,
right?
yeah,
right.
yeah. That's
like,
what I'm saying. Like, there's still room for people to code in assembly and stuff, but we're also using these higher level languages or even no code platforms. So I feel like there's going to be room for both in the future as well.
Definitely. I think it's just that you have to figure out like where is it faster to explain what you want versus do it yourself, right? And I think that's the tricky part. And it's very personal decision or personal kind of experience. Like I might like remember how to, load from a dot environment file like super easily. I've done it for years, and I just am much faster doing it than instructing the model to do it. While you, right, maybe never remember how to do it and have to go Google every time. Right? In your case, to use natural language, and so I think increasingly, right, like where the trade-off makes sense, you will use natural language to explain what you want, right? And I think like part of the reason, like what we've seen, it's not even necessarily about like, oh, I can do this even faster or better or whatever. It's just like it's less energy intensive, right? Like if you're spending a lot of day coding, by the end of the day, you can be burned out. And it's much easier to just kind of think and explain at the level of natural language where you're kind of saying, okay, I'm working on this particular feature and it requires these functions. I've kind of figured out what I need, right? And what I'll do for this particular function, like you break it down into small enough tasks that you then give natural language to do it. And it doesn't require the precise thinking where every single keystroke you need to be right, where with natural language, you can be a bit fuzzier and kind of move to reviewing the code that was generated instead of having to think through every piece of it. You kind of use that as an extension of your process, right? But not a replacement of your process.
We've got a question from Dame about small language models. Do you think we'll see a rise of small language models outside of Microsoft being the main player? And what areas and spaces do you believe are most beneficial for these small language models? I think you already mentioned autocomplete versus chat. Autocomplete's more tailored towards these smaller ones, but yeah.
Yeah, I would argue that it's already kind of a small language model. It's just unfortunately hidden in all the other coding pilot vendors, right, where they don't make it clear that it is that, right? So I think that's a great example of like where small language models are already existing. People don't necessarily call them that, but like you said, autocomplete is a good one. I think it really comes down to like the task of what you're doing. Things like, oh, if you're using these to help with generating a certain kind of test and stuff like that, do you really need a giant model for? And so I just see, like kind of the example I mentioned earlier of how Llama 270B is equivalent capability to Llama 3 8B, right? If we can run these on our computers, on our cell phones, and they're faster, right, and they're just as capable, what might that unlock, right? And so I think it's experimentation at this point. That if you can use a smaller model and achieve the thing you're trying to achieve, it's going to be faster and cheaper, right? And so I think ultimately you're going to move to that. And so as we start to figure out the use cases from the frontier models, right, people are going to start to break those down and say, hey, we can actually achieve this with a smaller model, right? And you're going to do that because it's cheaper, faster, and just as good. And so I think the future is quite bright for small language models. It's just a matter of figuring out the use cases that it makes sense, that where they're good enough and valuable enough to invest in. And then the last question around junior devs, right, by language models. What we're seeing is if you're getting into coding now, right, if you're only a few years in, that like you're by default, right? You didn't start with user manual and reading books, right, to figure out how to program. You didn't even start with Googling and Stack Overflow, or maybe you did, but not for that long, right? Like a lot of senior folks have very particular ways of working at this point, right? Because they've been Googling and Stack Overflowing for so long, right? And so we've seen that like junior devs tend to be a little bit more open-minded. That said, there's many senior devs who are open-minded and kind of but like junior devs are just growing up in a world that are like really impacting where like their way of building is with large language models. As a result, right, they're kind of inventing the new workflows. And so I think the junior devs that embrace using language models, small or large, right, to help them, right, are going to be some of the most prolific and best programmers there are. You know, I mean, maybe already today that's the case, right? But if not, then the next few years, 5 years, 10 years, right? I think the people who decide to be amplified by large language models, use them at a minimum as general text manipulation tools, right, are able to be that much more productive, able to have that much more energy and joy and bring that much more creativity, because they're not having to spend so much time and energy on the rote repetitive tasks. Instead, they learn to leverage the models there, and then they learn where's their expertise, where do they find joy in programming, and they focus on that part for them, outsource the other part for the models. So I think it's quite bright for junior developers if you embrace large language models. If you don't, I think it's remains to be seen, right? I'm not as optimistic about that, but I'm also biased, right? I'm building Continue.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I think it's such a great time for people learning to be able to utilize these tools and learn at such a much faster rate and be able so much more capable. If I had these tools when I was starting, I think I would. I'd like to think I would have taken great advantage of them, but who knows?
Yeah, and like these days I don't code so much, right? So like I find it super helpful for
Yeah.
me learning or like relearning and stuff like that, where I can just like highlight some code and be like, what is this doing? I can't figure this out, and like
Yeah.
use that to like refresh my brain, right? Or like, hey, I need to do this, right? And
Exactly.
so I think ongoing learning is also kind of critical, where like I feel like it's going to expand the number of like what we mean as a developer, right? Like so many more people are going to be able to code that couldn't previously. So many more people are going to be able to come in and out of building software, right? So I think we're going to see more personalized software, more customized software, more people building software. It's similar to the IDE, right? Everyone, when the IDE came out, was like, oh, we're going to have less developers, right? And then you go 10 or 20 years in the future, and there was like 1,000% increase in the number of developers. I think this is also going to just unlock kind of who can be a developer, how productive, how impactful they can be, what software they can build. I think it's just going to be a continued expansion, amplification of what we've seen over the last few decades.
And you're right, like empowering existing developers to be able to, switch stack or pick up a new language a lot easier as well.
Yeah, a great example of that is like my co-founder Nate, who does a lot of the development these days on Continue. Like he had never programmed in Kotlin, right? And we were building the JetBrains IntelliJ plugin for Continue, right? And there's a part where you need to interface with the IDE itself, and that is in Kotlin, right? And so he was using Continue as he was building the Continue JetBrains extension to help him figure out how to go from TypeScript, right, that we had built in VS Code to Kotlin, and it just accelerated his learning process and how fast he was able to do that. And I mean, of course, you have to always watch out for the bugs, things like that. So when you start to learn like where the edges are, what the capabilities are, the limitations, where like you can trust your instinct to maybe I should go Google this, right? Or you kind of get caught in loops, right? Maybe I should go check Stack Overflow and verify, right, that the suggestion I'm getting is good and I'm not getting lost in a rabbit hole. But very much like a thing you have to learn to do. It's not immediate when you.
Yeah, we got another message from Dame asking about kind of like a hybrid approach that we're seeing Apple and Microsoft taking, where they have a local LLM on device for some of the more privacy and faster stuff, and then also the ability to send data to the cloud for bigger, more compute intensive AI stuff. Do you see this as a trend that's going to continue, or?
I think so, right? No pun intended, right? That's what Continue has bet on. We enable you to use local models and cloud. The way I kind of think about it is like I almost like don't differentiate between local and cloud in my brain these days. It's kind of like think about it as one compute resource where you have some amount of compute already on your computer. You already paid for it, right? And then I think about it in terms of tasks and use cases, right? And so for that particular task, for that particular use case, right? Can I use my local compute already that I've already purchased that's for anything, right? Am I plugged in on power, right? Because these are very power intensive. If not, then maybe if I don't have enough compute available, if the task or use case is not capable of being done locally on device, because like then you don't have to do the round trip, you don't have to pay, or beyond like having paid for the compute already, right? Then you break out, right? If the capabilities aren't good enough of the local model, then you break out to using the cloud models, right? And so we're seeing a lot of folks do that as well, where they give their developers access to GPT-4 and Llama 3 70 billion, and their developers are learning like, okay, when can I go to billion, right? And maybe they go there first, right? If it doesn't seem like it's going the right direction, they then switch to GPT-4. It's a way to keep your costs down. And I mean, that's a good example. Like maybe you do 3 layers, right? You have Llama 3 8 billion on your computer. You have Llama 3 70 billion deployed in your cloud, right? And then soon Llama 3 405 billion is going to be deployed. So maybe that's too big for you to run, so you use that on Grok, right? And then you kind of use the 8 billion. You learn to use the 8 billion for anything, everything that you can do local, right? And then you break out to the 70 billion when the 8 billion can't do it, and then you break into the 405 billion when the 70 billion can't work, right? But you kind of structure it in that way where you're always kind of, I think, going for the things that are local, the things where you're getting the fastest, cheapest option, right? And then progressively use bigger and more expensive and slower options when the smaller ones aren't working. It's kind of how I think about it. Hopefully that's helpful, even though it doesn't directly answer the question.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great answer. I have a question myself while we're waiting for others. Nathaniel at the start mentioned that you might have talked about timelines. I might have missed that, but yeah, I'd be definitely curious and keen to hear about Continue's like roadmap going forward, if we can expect any cool new features and like, yeah, what we can expect.
Yeah, definitely. So still a small team. I think we're like 4 people now, right? Very recently kind of grew from 3 to 4, right? And so this is going to unlock at the moment, right? We added autocomplete, I think, a couple months ago now, and have been improving that quite a bit. So that's been a focus of like, how do we bridge the gap between kind of the best autocomplete system, one that you use with Continue. And so in the near term, we're very focused on making that better, right? And then on the roadmap side of things, Codestral and Mistral's emphasis on coding models, and we're seeing others kind of develop more specialized code. I'm quite optimistic about like next edit prediction, kind of think about like next things where it's like, okay, what are you going to do next in your keyboard, where it goes beyond just predicting the next line, but predicting, right? Like, here's the next few changes I'm going to make, right? I'm going to open this file over here, right? So I think a lot of the experimentation we're going to do in that direction on one hand. And then the other piece that I think you're going to see a lot more is I think you're going to see a lot more data from this cycle, from all of your code bases, from your Jira tickets, from your Confluence docs, right? I think that's going to be made available initially through RAG, right? And I think eventually through like domain adaptive continued pre-training, where you're taking that data and you're taking Llama 3 and you're basically continuing the pre-training process with all of that data to get a model custom to you. So like yesterday I saw OpenAI, I think, published a blog post, or I read it yesterday, maybe it came out earlier, about with Harvey, they created like a specialized GPT-4 for their legal use cases, right? And they were able to show that 97% of the time people preferred the kind of customized model to like the traditional GPT-4. So I think there's going to be a lot of promise in like pre-training and post-training techniques that result in models, right, that are better and capable of doing things done, right, without having to necessarily scale them up and scale up the amount of compute and the amount of data that is done. And so kind of those 3 areas, the what we call kind of like a team context engine for like pulling available, the kind of next edit prediction stuff, and the third one, right, like what the kind of I wouldn't call them frontier models, what the research labs are kind of pushing, where they're becoming more special on post-training and pre-training techniques to make these model more custom and personalized. Like those are the 3 areas that I think I'm most excited about, in addition to autocomplete, kind of the chat experience is even better.
Yeah, nice. Sorry, Ty, I just noticed, like, I mean, it's been happening kind of on and off, your voice cutting out. I'm not sure if there's anything you can do about that, but
yeah,
I just
thanks
thought
for
I'd
letting me
mention.
know. I'll move a little bit
It's not
closer to the
like-
Wi-Fi router. That's the first idea. Let me know if it keeps happening, and then maybe I can do
I
something
think
else.
it's good
I'll move
now.
closer.
Yeah.
Cool.
All good. Thank you for that. I think Nathaniel, do you have another question, or are you just giving a comment there?
Techfren, I think you mentioned you had some from the community as well. I'd love to like maybe see where.
Yeah, I've kind of been that roadmap one was one from the community. I have
Nice.
one kind of myself. You mentioned like I have a really big interest in these coding AI tools, and I've been like seeing what features they come out with and like comparing them. And kind of, I think it was last week or maybe even this week, I looked into Cursor. They had some updates, and they branded their kind of Copilot plus plus. And yeah, one of the cool things that they had is something you mentioned yourself, being kind of like the next edit prediction. So not just like tab completing code, but it could be moving to a new file or kind of beyond just the edits. Do you see any like differentiating features for Continue? I think like the biggest one that's really great is like the how open source you guys are and how supportive of the kind of open source movement you are. And I think that's a huge factor why I really like Continue. But yeah, any other like kind of getting you to spill like secret sauce or anything in the works, or
Yeah.
something I might have
I think
missed? Yeah.
yeah, no, definitely. I think the answer is right. We're all kind of trying like tools and kind of learning, and we're very focused at Continue of like what are the things people are actually. So we haven't invested much in agents. Like we've done quite a bit of experimentation. I would say we have invested quite a bit, right? But like we're not seeing people actually use those. The one that's most promising, right, kind of in that direction is like a code review where it would kind of be almost like a linter, right, where it helps you I mean, you specify the things you want it to check for, right, in your code, right, and you kind of run that. So we have an experimental kind of in that direction. We have an experimental feature in what we call prompt files, where you can like almost like with templated language kind of create prompts. Like, so if you have a very specific way of doing unit tests and it should go and pull, right, like a function or documentation and things like that, it can at compile time, right, pull all of the kind of fill in those little templates. We have kind of more about this in our docs, where you can actually do like a slash command. And so I'd say those two are the main ones. And kind of, yeah, Cursor came out with that last week, but like I just put in the chat, right, like something that Google's been working on for like 2 years, right, where they're predicting software development activities. It's something that we've been focused on for since I wrote a blog post about it last year, right? It's like we're very interested in like actually enabling people to use their development data, right? So all of those accepted, rejected, tab autocompletes, all of like the context that are kind of being pulled in. I think longer term, this is where we really start to differentiate because you have access to your data. We can empower you to actually use it to understand how to improve your system, to fine tune models, to domain adaptive, continue to pre-train, right? Like those kind of things are, I think, the most promising in the long run. Being able to have access to understand your system, right? And so how can we make that easy? We help you to really, I mean, not think of it as a black box of like, oh, I'm just given this thing, and if it's a wrong suggestion, manually start to think in the terms, okay, because I understand the system, because I have access to my data, right, I can now actually, when I get a bad or wrong suggestion, ask myself, why did I get that, right? And then ask myself, is there something I could do to improve the system and to improve the suggestions that I get in the future? And so we're very focused on like that as our kind of real differentiator in the long run, along with being open source and kind of unbundling the black box, really allowing you to optimize and customize and personalize every component of that system, right? But also offering sensible defaults, right? I think that's where a lot of our time and energy goes into, right? Like how do we, depending whether you can use open source or whether you have local compute, whether you can use commercial, right? How do we make those so like you don't have to come in and optimize and customize and personalize every single time for everything, right? That's fun and joyful, right? When you have free time or you have extra time, but it's not the best, right? If you're just trying to get your job done. And so also kind of investing in figuring out what are our users most using, what are their constraints, and then offering sensible defaults for those.
Yeah. Dame has asked, what are your thoughts on the Mamba models? If you have any.
The Mamba models. Yeah.
Mamba, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's well needed, right? In terms of I think there's a lot of room for architecture improvement, right? So when I first got into machine learning, right, it was more vanilla neural networks that became recurrent neural networks and convolutional neural networks, like those were the most popular. And then the attention is all you need paper came out and transformers started to take over everything. And so one way to get around the scaling laws, right, or to keep AI progress going would be to improve on the architecture of the transformer and even of the compound AI systems. There's this concept from the Berkeley Artificial Intelligence Research Lab that I've really come to appreciate, where it's like just recognizing that the state of the art is not a single monolithic model, but often multiple models, and often like using traditional programming and using supervised machine learning and in concert as a system, right? And so I think Mamba models are a really great example of someone trying to push, right? Okay, like how can we go beyond the transformer architecture? Is it going to work? I don't know, right? Is it going to lead to better properties? I don't know, but I think it's much needed research. There's a few other kind of approaches that I think are also exciting, right? But I think they're a ways off, right? They're definitely more in the research stage than the production stage.
Yeah, I think I agree with you there. I think there could be some limitations with transformers and potentially like huge levels of scale of improvement if we find a better architecture, if it exists.
Definitely.
Yeah. Nathaniel, did you have questions? I'm like, I think we've went through all the
Maybe
other
anyone else
ones.
wants to jump in and ask anything?
Or yeah, or anyone raise their hand.
Fry 69 from the Continue community is on, so maybe there's a more Continue specific question, or many other folks who are just here listening would love to. Oh, I see one coming in from Nathaniel. So Mamba has the
Yes.
capability to generate tokens retroactively. The transformer model discards anything that isn't prediction by giving it more score. Do you see large context Mamba model code base refactoring? Maybe, right? Like, to be honest, I haven't gone super deep with Mamba models, and so, yeah, I mean, it sounds promising, right, from what you describe. I think the hard part about any kind of large scale changes to code bases, whether they're full and whether they're automatic, right, is that I think software development isn't an isolated activity, right? For one, so it doesn't involve one person, it involves many developers often, and often many designers and business people and other folks, users, right, as constituents. And then also, it's it's requires a lot of context that's outside the code base, right? So it's stuff that's in your Jira tickets, it's stuff that's in your head, right? It's stuff that is more like tacit knowledge, like implicit, it's not explicitly written. And so I think what's needed to unlock automatic code base refactoring is maybe in going to Mamba architecture, right? But also like how do we involve a lot of the relevant context that you need to actually be able to reliably make changes. And the other issue is that, right, when you need to create large changes, right, like you run into context window size issues, you run into cost issues and things like that. You run into reliability issues of the models, like hallucinating. Like the more you're using it, the more likely they hallucinate. And what you need for software development is like if you get one thing wrong, if you hallucinate one thing, right, the program won't work. So I think in addition to like architecture improvements and thinking about how to bring in more context that's, you know, I mean, from the software development lifecycle, that's from all of the folks involved in building that software, is also like, how can you take advantage of the properties of code? How can you maybe run the code or run a linter or try to compile the code, right? And kind of create these feedback loops where if you're going to be doing such a large scale change to the code base, how can you make sure that there's maybe steps of doing it? And then if it's a 15-step process, right, you need then the UI UX on top of it to be able to go at step 7, it went wrong, right? Let me retry it, right? And have the model try again, right, using the new information, and then it completes steps 8 through 15 correctly the second time it does it, right? And there's like a few different pieces, right, to get large scale automatic code base refactoring, and Mamba architecture could be helpful for that, but also I think it's not going to be the only thing that gets us there.
Yeah. Great answer. I'm not sure how long